In Australia and New Zealand, press freedom is perhaps taken for granted. Why should we care about World Press Freedom Day in Australia and New Zealand?
Well, you say it's taken for granted in both Australia and New Zealand, and my first comment would be that I would distinguish those two countries. I'm not sure we put them in the same basket. While they are both Western democracies, my own impression from a distance is that New Zealand has a much better track record with media freedom than Australia does. If you look to the Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index, in recent years, certainly New Zealand has had a much stronger performance, and I would put that partly down to the fact that you have your Bill of Rights Act there with freedom of expression protected. Australia does not have that. So it is a constant struggle in Australia to have free expression considerations taken into account by governments and courts, because we do not have that constitutional backing.
Uh, why is it the broader public in Australia and New Zealand seem to ignore World Press Freedom Day?
Well, I'm not sure that it has been brought much to the attention of the broader citizen. I think you have to understand that most citizens are predominantly concerned with what affects them and their lives on a day-to-day basis. And media freedom, as you said at the outset, is something you don't necessarily appreciate until you start to lose it. And it's not something that is at the forefront of most citizens' minds. They are much more concerned with, things affecting their daily lives, their income, government decisions to do with health and education and these sorts of things. And the extent to which this can be discussed in the community is really something that needs to be sold to them. So I think it's a wonderful development that in New Zealand the Pacific Media Centre has taken the initiative to work with UNESCO to have the World Press Freedom Day inaugural celebration there this year.
Here in New Zealand and in most Western countries, we see a decrease of journalists as big media organizations are cutting down costs by firing journalists or simply shutting down the newspapers. At the same time, the number of public relations practitioners are increasing. To what extent is that a threat to press freedom?
Well, I think it's certainly a problem for the media and the free discourse, in particularly political discourse in the community, when the major media groups are under financial strain. That's a major difficulty facing the Western democracies like Australia and New Zealand, particularly the demise of the revenue models in newspapers and the fragmentation of major what were formerly newspaper groups as they've lost their revenue, particularly their classified and real estate and car sales revenue. But as far as media freedom goes, I mean, this has its own implications. So one implication is that when these larger companies start to break down, there isn't as strong a voice for media freedom. There isn't the budget to challenge through the courts or through lobbying for to oppose government measures to scale back media freedoms. And it becomes almost a slippery slope where these quite treasured freedoms we've had for at least some centuries start to get eroded because the financial model is on the demise.
How big a threat is concentration of media ownership in the media industry to press freedom?
Well, concentration of media ownership is a concern where audiences' reading and viewing and online habits are restricted in some way to particular products. And this is still a concern certainly for regional areas where there may only be one or two voices coming into these communities, but it's becoming less a concern as citizens in any country, well, in any Western country, are getting more access to international material and other voices from within their own community through social media and through various websites. So I'm not saying the problem of concentration of media ownership has evaporated. It is still an issue, but I think it's becoming less an issue as people get more connected through the Web 2 environment.
And tying into that, Professor Pearson, you are an expert in social media, of course, and how do you see social media and new media in general influencing press freedom?
Well, it's a double-edged sword for social media and media freedom, and part of my address in Auckland next on World Press Freedom Day is looking at free expression in terms of bloggers and citizen journalists and, you know, the ordinary citizen, their rights to free expression in this new environment versus what we've traditionally called press freedom or media freedom, which has really been a subset of free expression. Now that all citizens have the potential to publish, and sometimes quite broadly depending on the topic and their level of following on social media, it starts to make us question who really is a journalist and what special privileges in media freedom a journalist deserves or should demand, as opposed to other citizens who may well be sometimes even reaching a larger audience.
And final question, Professor Pearson, what can realistically be done to facilitate better conditions for press freedom in Australia and New Zealand and also in the Pacific?
Well, I'm not sure there is an easy fix for media freedom, but one thing is certainly that groups like or institutions like the Pacific Media Centre, Reporters Without Borders, Transparency International, these sorts of organisations can take forge a higher profile in the discourse about important freedoms like free expression and media freedom. I think partly because of a resource question and partly because of the demands of so much else. Often these institutions have small staffing, or they're often staffed by volunteers as NGOs. It's been hard for them to get that message across, but I think they need to step forward now that we're seeing the larger media organisations less able to finance that lobbying power for free expression, and really step up and fill that gap. So I think really there's a lot more that can be done for the community literacy about both the media itself and about the various rights and freedoms that the ordinary citizen and journalist should have.